Janitor, stepped between the bullies and the trembling boy, not knowing the child's father was the vampire king. But when those ancient eyes met hers at the school gate, she realized her simple act of kindness had just entangled her in a world where protection comes with a blood price. Maya Chen's mop squeaked against the gymnasium floor in the rhythm she'd perfected over 3 years of night shifts at Riverside Elementary, each stroke erasing the chaos of another day, filled with children's laughter and tears, while she remained invisible in the shadows, where she preferred to exist, ever since her breakdown as a social worker, when she'd failed to save too many kids, and the system had crushed what remained of her faith in happy endings. The antiseptic smell of bleach mingled with the lingering scent of adolescent sweat and rubber sneakers as she worked her way across the polished wood, finding peace in the methodical motion that quieted the memories of case files stamped with red ink and children who'd slipped through cracks she couldn't seal. A sob echoed from the boys' locker room, raw and desperate, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. Maya froze, her protective instincts flaring despite every wall she'd built around her heart since leaving social services. She'd learned to recognize the difference between playground tears and real pain, and this sound carried the weight of genuine terror. Setting down her mop, she moved toward the locker room with quiet steps, her worn sneakers silent against the tile as another choked cry reached her ears. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the rows of metal lockers as she rounded the corner and found them. 3 older boys, probably fifth graders, circled a smaller figure hunched in the corner like wolves cornering prey. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The victim was 8 at most, his school uniform torn at the shoulder, dark hair falling across his face as he pressed himself against the cold metal lockers. Strange pale marks decorated his neck, almost like bite marks but too precise, too deliberate to be accidental injuries. The biggest bully, a red-haired boy with cruel eyes, clutched a sharpened pencil like a weapon. "Monster," he hissed, poking at the cowering child. "Freak vampire. We should stake you before you bite someone." The other boys laughed, but Maya caught the tremor in their voices, the way they kept their distance even as they tormented their victim. They were afraid of him, she realized, which made their cruelty even more vicious. Maya stepped into the circle without hesitation, her voice cutting through their taunts with the authority she'd once wielded in courtrooms and crisis meetings. "That's enough. All of you. Out. Now." The boys scattered like roaches when the lights came on, but not before the redhead spat a final taunt over his shoulder. "Watch out, lady. Monsters bite." Maya knelt beside the trembling child, noting how he flinched from her approach but didn't run. His eyes, when he finally looked up, were too old for his face, pale blue like winter ice, and filled with a weariness that belonged to someone who'd seen centuries rather than years. His skin was translucent, almost luminous in the harsh fluorescent light, and his touch when she helped him stand was cold enough to make her gasp. "I'm Maya," she said softly, the same voice she'd once used with traumatized children in hospital rooms and police stations. "What's your name?" "Adrian," he whispered, his voice carrying a faint accent she couldn't place. "Adrian Blackthorne." She helped him clean the scratches on his arms with paper towels from the dispenser, noting how quickly the small cuts seemed to heal, how his skin knitted itself back together with inhuman speed. "You shouldn't have helped me," Adrian said as she finished bandaging a deeper scrape on his wrist. "He'll come for you now." "Who will come for you?" Maya asked, but Adrian just shook his head, fear flickering across his features like candlelight in a storm. "My father," he said finally. "He doesn't like it when people get involved." Something in his tone made Maya's blood run cold, but she forced a smile and walked him to the school's front entrance, where a black limousine waited in the amber glow of streetlights. The car was expensive, pristine, and somehow wrong in this suburban setting, like a raven among sparrows. Adrian's father emerged from the vehicle with fluid grace, tall and imposing in an expensive black coat that looked tailored rather than bought off any rack. Maya's breath caught as their eyes met across the iron school gate. His gaze was ancient, predatory, beautiful, and utterly inhuman, the kind of stare that catalogued weaknesses and calculated threats with the precision of someone who'd spent lifetimes hunting. Time seemed to fracture around them, the ordinary world of school zones and safety patrols dissolving under the weight of his attention. He was handsome in a way that hurt to look at directly, all sharp angles and pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But there was something fundamentally wrong about him, something that made every survival instinct Maya possessed scream warnings she couldn't name. Adrian ran to him, speaking in rapid whispers that sounded like another language entirely, something old and musical and dark. The man listened without moving, his pale hand resting on his son's shoulder with surprising gentleness, while his eyes never left Maya's face. "You protected my son," he said. And his voice was like velvet draped over steel, cultured and precise with just a hint of an accent that might have been European or might have been something far older. "In my world, such debts are not forgotten." Maya found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "He's just a child. Everyone deserves protection." The man smiled, and Maya caught a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp, too white, before his lips curved into something that might have been amusement, or might have been hunger. She noticed his pale hand, where it touched the gate, how it cast no reflection in the puddle of rainwater at his feet, how the metal seemed to grow colder under his touch. "Yes," he said softly, "they do." He reached into his coat and produced an ornate business card, cream-colored paper that felt warm against her skin despite the night air. The cardstock was heavy, expensive, embossed with a family crest that showed a raven perched on a crown. Lucian Blackthorn, she read, though no address or phone number accompanied the name. "We will speak again, Maya Chen," he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent ice through her veins. "I make it my business to know those who show kindness to my son. There are so few of them in this world." Adrian climbed into the limousine without looking back, but Maya caught a glimpse of his pale face in the window as they pulled away, his expression guilty and afraid and infinitely sad. She stood at the gate long after the car disappeared into the night, the business card burning in her palm like a brand, wondering what she'd stumbled into, and why every instinct she possessed told her that her quiet life as a night janitor had just come to a violent end. The card felt different somehow, heavier than paper should be, and when she looked down at it again under the streetlight, she could have sworn the raven's eyes blinked. Maya woke the next morning to find the business card had changed overnight, the cream-colored paper now bearing an address in elegant script beneath Lucian Blackthorn's name. Blackthorn Estate, 1247, Ravens Hollow Drive, and below that in smaller letters, 8 p.m., Friday. The transformation felt impossible, like finding footprints in fresh snow when no one had walked there, but the ink looked as permanent as if it had always been there, and Maya's hands trembled as she traced the letters with her fingertip. She spent her lunch break at the public library, hunching over outdated computers to research the Blackthorn family, finding only fragments and whispers scattered across genealogy sites and local history forums. Old money stretching back to the 1600s, real estate holdings that spanned 3 counties, a family tree full of gaps where records should have been but weren't. The more she dug, the stranger it became. Missing persons cases from the 1980s that mentioned the Blackthorn name in witness statements before being mysteriously closed without resolution. Newspaper clippings about charitable donations that always seemed to coincide with investigations going cold, and court records sealed by judges who'd later died in accidents that raised no official suspicion but left uncomfortable questions in their wake. The family's reclusive nature was legendary, even among the old money families who valued privacy above publicity, and Maya found herself staring at a photograph from 1952 that showed a man who looked exactly like Lucian Blackthorne standing beside a vintage car, unchanged by the decades that should have aged him beyond recognition. At work that night, she noticed Adrian's absence immediately, the way silence filled the spaces where his quiet footsteps should have echoed through the halls during her rounds. The three bullies who'd tormented him were also missing from the after-school program roster, and when Maya asked Mrs. Henderson about the transfers, the principal's nervous laughter didn't quite hide the tremor in her voice. The Blackthorne family made some very generous donations to our anti-bullying initiatives, Mrs. Henderson explained, wringing her hands like she was washing invisible stains. They wanted to ensure their son's educational environment remained safe and supportive. The other children's families decided a fresh start at different schools would be beneficial for everyone involved. Maya pressed for details, but Mrs. Henderson's answers became increasingly evasive, her eyes darting toward security cameras as if she expected to be overheard, and Maya left work that evening with the unsettling certainty that she'd witnessed the quiet application of power that made problems disappear without leaving official traces. Friday arrived with unseasonable cold that made her breath visible in the November air as she drove through increasingly rural roads toward Ravens Hollow Drive, past farmland and forest that seemed untouched by suburban sprawl. The Blackthorne estate announced itself with massive wrought iron gates that rose from stone pillars carved with the family crest. The raven and crown design worked into the metal with Gothic precision that spoke of centuries rather than decades of craftsmanship. Security cameras tracked her approach from hidden positions among the oak trees, their red recording lights blinking like predator eyes in the gathering dusk. The gate swung open without her touching the intercom, smooth and silent as if operated by invisible hands, and Maya drove up a winding driveway that curved through manicured gardens where no flowers bloomed despite the elaborate landscaping. The mansion itself defied easy description. A Gothic revival masterpiece that seemed frozen in the 1800s, with towers and spires that clawed at the darkening sky like fingers reaching for something beyond mortal comprehension. Gargoyles perched on every corner and cornice, their stone faces worn smooth by weather but somehow still menacing, as if they watched visitors with carved eyes that held too much intelligence for mere decoration. Lucian Blackthorne waited for her at the front entrance, framed by an archway that could have graced a cathedral, his pale skin luminous against the black marble columns. He moved with fluid grace as he descended the steps to greet her, every gesture controlled and deliberate like a dancer who'd rehearsed each movement across centuries of practice. "Welcome to my home, Maya Chen," he said, offering his arm with old-world courtesy that felt genuine rather than performative. "I trust you found your way without difficulty." Inside, the mansion's grandeur overwhelmed her senses. Marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow fragments across walls hung with paintings that looked medieval in their age and artistry, and furniture that belonged in museums rather than private residences. The staff moved through these spaces with inhuman grace, their footsteps silent on floors that should have echoed, their eyes reflecting light strangely when they turned toward her with polite smiles that never quite reached their faces. Maya noticed how they avoided mirrors, how they seemed to glide rather than walk, how they appeared and disappeared through doorways, like shadows given human form. Lucian led her to a library that rivaled university collections, walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes whose titles were written in languages she couldn't identify, and settled into a wing-back chair that looked older than America itself. "You have questions," he said, pouring wine from a crystal decanter into goblets that caught the firelight like liquid rubies. "I prefer directness to the elaborate social dances that mortals seem to favor, so I shall answer them honestly. I am what your folklore calls a vampire, though the reality is both more complex and more mundane than your entertainment industry suggests. I am 437 years old, turned during the Great Plague when death seemed preferable to watching everyone I loved succumb to disease that physicians could neither understand nor cure. Maya's logical mind rejected what she was hearing, but her instincts recognized truth in his tone, in the weight of centuries that seemed to press down on his shoulders like invisible chains. Adrian is my heir, born from a union with a human woman who died bringing him into this world, Lucian continued, his voice softening with grief that time hadn't diminished. He is Dampier, half vampire, half human, the only child of his kind to survive past infancy in over 3 centuries. Most die within days of birth, caught between two natures that war against each other until one destroys the other. Adrian lived because his human mother's love somehow strengthened what should have been his greatest weakness. He needs human contact to maintain his humanity, but my kind sees him as an abomination, a mongrel who represents everything they fear about contamination and change. Your protection of him triggered ancient laws that govern vampire society, codes written in blood and sealed with oaths that cannot be broken without consequences that extend far beyond individual lives. You are now under my house's protection, which means you belong to this world now, whether you choose it or not. Maya protested that she'd simply helped a frightened child, but Lucian activated a wall screen that showed security footage from the school, grainy black and white images that captured 3 figures moving with inhuman speed through empty hallways toward the gymnasium where she'd found Adrian. They were vampire assassins, he explained, sent by the Crimson Court to eliminate what they consider a genetic mistake before he could mature into a threat to their carefully maintained secrecy. Your intervention saved his life and exposed their operation, forcing them to retreat and regroup. They know now that Adrian has human protection, which changes the political calculus in ways that affect every vampire court on 3 continents. The offered position as Adrian's guardian came with a salary that made Maya's eyes water, but the real temptation was the boy himself. Brilliant, lonely, desperate for genuine human connection that his father's immortal nature couldn't provide. She agreed to a trial period, moving her few possessions into the mansion's east wing, where Persian rugs covered floors that predated the Industrial Revolution, and windows looked out over gardens that bloomed in impossible colors under moonlight. The household rules were simple but absolute. Never enter the West Wing after sunset, when Lucian conducted business that required privacy from human eyes. Wear the protective amulet at all times, because it would warn her of supernatural dangers her mortal senses couldn't detect, and understand that choosing to remain meant accepting that Lucian's enemies would now consider her a legitimate target worthy of elimination. Adrian flourished under her care like a plant finally receiving proper sunlight, showing her artwork that took her breath away, hauntingly beautiful drawings of sunrise and sunset rendered in perfect detail despite his confession that he'd never actually seen the sun rise or set. His talent was extraordinary, but Maya noticed the increasing security measures around the estate. More guards patrolling the grounds with weapons she didn't recognize, surveillance equipment that appeared overnight in previously empty rooms, and iron shutters that descended over every window when darkness fell like protective armor against threats that moved in shadows. Something was hunting them, she realized, and their respite was temporary rather than permanent. The truth revealed itself 3 weeks into her residence when she found Adrian in the mansion's kitchen at midnight, guilt written across his pale features as he fed from blood bags that Lucian provided to sustain his Dampier nature. The boy was ashamed, afraid she would see him as the monster the bullies had called him, but Maya held him while he cried and told him that needing food didn't make him evil any more than her need for air made her weak. Their tender moment shattered when alarms screamed through the mansion's halls, high-pitched wails that sent the staff racing through corridors with supernatural speed toward predetermined defensive positions. Vampire assassins had breached the grounds. Members of the Crimson Court, who believed Adrian's Dampier nature made him an abomination that threatened the careful balance between their hidden world and human ignorance. In the chaos of battle, Maya was separated from Adrian and found herself cornered in the conservatory by a female vampire whose beauty was as sharp and deadly as broken glass. Isabella introduced herself with mocking courtesy before revealing the truth that Lucian had hidden behind noble intentions. He hadn't just offered Maya protection under ancient vampire law, he had claimed her as his own under blood bonds that were older than written history. "You're his now," Isabella hissed, her fangs gleaming in the shattered moonlight streaming through bullet-riddled windows. Body and soul, heart and mind, bound by magic that makes divorce impossible and death the only escape. The only way to break such bonds is through his destruction or yours, and since he's survived 4 centuries of attempts on his life, I think we both know which option is more likely to succeed. Isabella's revelation hung in the air like poison as glass from the conservatory's shattered windows crunched under Maya's feet. The female vampire's perfect features twisted with cruel satisfaction at having delivered such devastating news. But before Maya could process the full implications of being claimed under ancient blood law, Lucian materialized behind Isabella with inhuman speed that made the air itself seem to bend around his movement. His hand closed around Isabella's throat with gentle pressure that somehow conveyed more menace than violence, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of centuries when he spoke. "You overstep your bounds, Isabella of the Crimson Court, and your presence in my home uninvited constitutes an act of war that will have consequences extending far beyond this night's bloodshed." Isabella laughed despite the hand at her throat, her own fangs gleaming as she met Lucian's ancient gaze without flinching. "The truth remains unchanged regardless of your threats, Blackthorn," she said with venom that matched her beauty's sharp edges. "You bound her without consent, claimed her through deception, and now she carries the mark of your house whether she understands what that means or not." Maya backed away from both vampires, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of words that felt like puzzle pieces from different boxes. And Lucian's expression shifted from menace to something approaching regret as he released Isabella and turned toward Maya with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "The blood bond was not my intention when I touched that gate," he said, his voice carrying honesty that cut deeper than any lie could have. "It is an ancient magic that activates when a vampire of sufficient power encounters a human whose life force resonates with their own, a connection that cannot be forced or faked, but only discovered through contact, that reveals compatible essences. When our skin touched through those iron bars, the bond began forming whether I willed it or not, tying our life forces together in ways that transcend mere physical existence." Maya felt something shift inside her consciousness as he spoke, a sudden awareness of his presence that went beyond her normal senses, as if a door had opened in her mind to reveal a room she'd never known existed. She could sense his emotions now, the genuine remorse warring with protective fury, the weight of centuries pressing down on his thoughts like stones in deep water. The connection flowed both ways, she realized with growing horror, meaning he could feel her terror, her sense of betrayal, her desperate need to understand what had been done to her without permission or warning. Isabella watched this realization dawn across Maya's features with predatory satisfaction. "You see it now, don't you?" she purred, circling them both like a shark, scenting blood in dark waters. The great Lucian Blackthorn, so noble in his protection of the innocent, failed to mention that saving you required enslaving you to his will for eternity. Maya's anger flared white-hot, but through the bond she felt Lucian's own anguish at her pain, his desperate wish that circumstances had allowed for choice rather than magical compulsion. "The bond means more than shared emotions," he continued, his words heavy with implications that sent ice through Maya's veins. "Adrian is no longer just my heir, but yours as well, connected to you through blood magic that makes you his second parent in the eyes of vampire law. Every court in the world will now see you as a threat to their power structure because you represent something they have never encountered. A human with legitimate claim to vampire authority through bonds that cannot be broken or denied. The protection I offered was not charity, but survival, for all of us, because the alternative was watching you die slowly as the courts eliminated every trace of your influence on my son. Maya's legs gave out, and she sank onto a marble bench amid the ruined conservatory, surrounded by the scent of exotic flowers and spilled blood, while trying to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. "We are bound together now," Lucian said, kneeling before her with movements that seemed more supplication than mere courtesy. "The only ways to sever such connections are through complete victory over our enemies. Ensuring our safety allows the bond to evolve naturally, or through death, which would likely claim all three of us, given how deeply the magic has already intertwined our life forces." Isabella's laughter echoed through the conservatory like breaking crystal. "How romantic," she said with mockery that cut like blades. "The ancient vampire lord and his unwilling human bride, bound by magic neither chose, protecting a Dampier child that the entire vampire world wants to see destroyed. This is not protection, Blackthorn. This is a slow-motion suicide that will take decades to complete." Through the bond, Maya felt Lucian's resolve harden into something approaching diamond in its unbreakable determination. "Then we ensure our victory is neither slow nor uncertain," he replied, rising to his full height with predatory grace that reminded Maya exactly what kind of creature she was now bound to for eternity. "The Crimson Court made their position clear when they sent assassins into my home to murder a child under my protection." Isabella's expression shifted from mockery to something approaching respect. "You would risk war with three courts to protect one human and one Dampier?" she asked, and Maya heard genuine curiosity beneath the vampire's calculated cruelty. Lucian's smile revealed fangs that gleamed like polished ivory in the moonlight streaming through broken glass. "I have already declared war by allowing the bond to complete itself," he said with quiet finality. The moment Maya's life force merged with mine, every vampire court on 3 continents became my enemy, because she represents evolution they cannot control or predict. The old ways demand her death to preserve their illusion of supremacy over mortal affairs. Isabella studied them both, with eyes that held centuries of political calculation. "And if she chooses to reject the bond, to demand her freedom despite the magical connections that tie you together?" she asked with the tone of someone probing for weaknesses in apparently solid foundations. Lucian turned toward Maya, and through their connection, she felt his willingness to accept whatever choice she made, even if it meant his own destruction. "The bond cannot be rejected any more than gravity can be ignored," he said with gentle honesty that somehow hurt more than lies would have. "It exists whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we fight against it or embrace what it offers. Maya can choose how to respond to its existence, but the connection itself is permanent, until death severs what magic has joined." Maya stood on shaking legs, glass crunching beneath her feet, as she faced the 2 vampires who represented opposite sides of a conflict she'd never asked to join. The awareness of Lucian's presence in her mind felt like having another heartbeat inside her chest, foreign yet somehow necessary, and she could sense his ancient loneliness, his desperate hope that she might find something worth preserving in the bond that had been forced upon them both. Through the shattered conservatory windows, she could see Adrian hiding behind a marble column in the garden, his pale face streaked with tears as he watched the confrontation that would determine his fate along with theirs. Isabella waited for Maya's response with predatory patience, clearly expecting the human to reject bonds she'd never chosen, while Lucian stood perfectly still with the terrible patience of someone who had learned across centuries that some decisions could not be rushed or influenced. Maya felt the weight of their combined attention, the magnitude of choices that would echo across vampire society for generations to come, and realized that her quiet life as a night janitor had not just ended, but been completely obliterated, replaced by responsibilities she couldn't fully comprehend, and a future that held either unprecedented victory or certain death for everyone she'd come to care about. The blood bond pulsed between her and Lucian like a second heartbeat, alien yet undeniably real, carrying with it the promise of power she'd never sought, and dangers she could barely imagine. While Adrian watched from the shadows with eyes that held too much understanding for his young face, waiting to learn whether the woman who'd protected him from schoolyard bullies would have the courage to accept protection that came with a price measured in blood and bound by magic older than written history. The news of the blood bond spread through vampire society like plague through medieval villages, whispered in ancient tongues across continents, and carried by messengers who moved faster than mortal eyes could follow, reaching every court and coven within hours of Isabella's escape from the Blackthorn estate. Maya learned of the spreading chaos through Lucian's carefully controlled updates, each piece of intelligence arriving like another nail in the coffin of her former life as the vampire world reacted to something they'd never encountered, a human legitimately bonded to one of their most powerful lords, carrying authority they couldn't strip away or ignore. Marcus Dracul, the ancient vampire who led the Crimson Court from his fortress in the Carpathian Mountains, declared formal war on Lucian's house within 24 hours. His proclamation, written in blood on parchment, made from human skin and delivered by ravens whose eyes glowed red in the darkness. Maya held the declaration with trembling hands, reading words that condemned her as an abomination whose very existence threatened the careful balance between vampire society and human ignorance, while Lucian translated the archaic Latin phrases that sentenced them all to death by any means necessary. The political implications unfolded like a chess game played by masters across centuries, each move calculated to maximize damage while maintaining plausible deniability. And Maya quickly discovered that Dampiers like Adrian weren't just hunted for their mixed nature, but because they represented something far more dangerous: the ability to reproduce. To create an army that bridged human and vampire worlds without the weaknesses that plagued either species. Unlike full vampires who could only create more of their kind through the turning process that often ended in madness or death, Dampiers could have children naturally, potentially spawning a hybrid race that would render traditional vampire society obsolete within generations. Maya's former life disappeared piece by piece, like a photograph burning from the edges inward, each element systematically destroyed by forces that moved in shadows and left no traces for human authorities to follow. Her apartment burned in an electrical fire that investigators couldn't quite explain, consuming everything she'd owned along with the building's entire third floor while mysteriously sparing the floors above and below. Her few friends began receiving anonymous threats that sent them fleeing to relatives in distant cities, too terrified to maintain contact with someone whose mere acquaintance had apparently marked them for elimination. Her employment history vanished from computer databases as if she'd never worked anywhere. Her social security number flagged in systems she'd never heard of. Her entire legal existence slowly erased by vampires, who understood that isolation was often more effective than violence in breaking human resistance to their will. She was cut off from everything human except Adrian, who clung to her as his anchor to humanity, while the blood bond deepened daily, creating connections that transcended mere emotion to become something approaching shared consciousness. Lucian began training Maya in combat techniques that predated modern warfare, teaching her to fight with weapons forged from silver and blessed steel, while explaining vampire politics that made medieval court intrigue look simple by comparison. The sessions took place in the mansion's underground gymnasium, a space carved from living rock that had witnessed centuries of preparation for wars, both public and private, and Maya discovered that the blood bond had enhanced her physical capabilities beyond human limits, without making her truly superhuman. Her strength increased but remained bounded by mortal flesh. Her speed improved but couldn't match vampire reflexes. Her endurance expanded but still required rest and recovery that immortal beings didn't need. The training was brutal and unforgiving, designed to prepare her for enemies who had spent centuries perfecting their killing techniques. But Maya found herself adapting with startling speed, as if the bond carried not just shared emotions, but accumulated knowledge from Lucian's long experience with supernatural combat. Their growing intimacy complicated everything, as the blood bond forced them to experience each other's emotions without the barriers that normally protected individual consciousness from outside influence, creating a dangerous attraction that neither could afford, but neither could entirely resist. Maya felt Lucian's ancient loneliness like a physical ache in her chest, his desperate hope that she might choose to stay despite the horrors that surrounded them, his guilt over binding her to a fate she'd never asked for, mixed with selfish relief that he was no longer completely alone. In return, her own emotions flowed toward him, fear transmuted into determination, anger at being manipulated balanced by growing understanding of the impossible choices he'd faced, and underneath it all, a treacherous warmth that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with seeing the man beneath the monster, the father who would risk everything to protect his son, regardless of personal cost. Victor Blackthorne arrived on a November night when frost painted the windows with crystalline patterns that looked like frozen tears, bringing with him a coven of 12 vampires whose loyalty to Lucian's family stretched back centuries to blood debts and saved lives that created bonds stronger than mere politics. Victor was younger than Lucian by perhaps 50 years, but carried himself with the same lethal grace, his dark hair and pale features marking him clearly as family, while his modern clothing and casual manner suggested someone more comfortable adapting to changing times than his elder brother. He revealed that the Blackthorne family had protected Dhampir children for over 300 years, believing they represented evolution rather than abomination, secretly providing sanctuary for the rare children who survived birth, only to face persecution from both human and vampire societies that saw them as threats to established order. Victor brought disturbing news along with reinforcements. Marcus Dracul had convinced the European Council and the Asian Federation that Maya represented an existential threat to vampire secrecy because a bonded human could potentially expose their existence to mortal governments equipped with modern weapons and surveillance technology that made traditional hiding places obsolete. They believed that Maya's human connections, enhanced by supernatural abilities granted through the bond, could bridge worlds that had remained separate for millennia, creating chaos that would end with vampire extinction under nuclear fire and human hatred. Maya met the other members of Lucian's household during strategy sessions that revealed the complex web of relationships that sustained their isolated community. Each person carrying stories of impossible choices required to exist between two worlds that offered no easy sanctuary. Elena had been turned during World War II to protect her human family from Nazi persecution, trading her mortality for the power to keep her children safe while watching them age and die across decades that felt like heartbeats to her vampire consciousness. Thomas survived childhood as a Dhampir through careful secrecy and constant movement, growing to adulthood before finding sanctuary with Lucian's family and becoming head of security for an estate that housed the most wanted targets in vampire society. Dr. Winters had served the house for 40 years after accidentally treating Lucian's injuries following an assassination attempt, his medical knowledge proving too valuable to waste, and his moral flexibility allowing him to accept realities that would have driven most humans insane. Each told Maya stories of the prices paid for choosing protection over freedom, safety over truth, survival over the luxury of moral absolutes, in a world where compromise often meant the difference between life and death. Marcus Dracul's forces struck during Adrian's birthday celebration, the first the boy had ever experienced with someone who genuinely cared for his happiness, rather than merely his political value, transforming what should have been joy into nightmare, as coordinated attacks targeted the estate's defenses and the humans within its walls. The assault was brutal and precisely planned, combining modern weapons with ancient vampire abilities to create chaos that tested every security measure Lucian had implemented across centuries of siege experience. Maya fought alongside immortal warriors whose speed and strength made her feel clumsy despite her enhanced abilities. But she quickly realized that the attackers were hunting her specifically rather than trying to capture the estate or eliminate Lucian. They believed that killing the human would break the blood bond and drive Lucian into grief madness that would eliminate both threats while leaving Adrian vulnerable to capture or execution. A strategy that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of bonds forged through genuine connection rather than mere magical compulsion. During the battle, Thomas threw himself between Adrian and a vampire assassin's silver blade, taking wounds that would have been instantly fatal to a human while buying precious seconds for Maya to reach the boy's side and shield him with her own body. Dr. Winters disappeared in the confusion, dragged away by attackers who clearly intended to use his knowledge of the household's vulnerabilities for future strikes, and Maya felt his terror through connections she didn't fully understand, as he was bundled into a van that vanished into the night. The message was unmistakably clear. Everyone Maya cared about was now a legitimate target in a war she'd never chosen to join, and the only way to protect them was to eliminate the threat at its source before Marcus Dracule's patience ran out, and he decided that total destruction was preferable to prolonged siege. In the aftermath, as they counted wounds and losses while tending to Thomas's injuries and planning rescue operations for Dr. Winters, Maya demanded to learn everything about vampire combat and politics that might give her an edge in the conflicts to come. Lucian revealed the full scope of their situation with the blunt honesty that their circumstances demanded. 3 major vampire courts had allied against them. Traditional vampire law gave them the right to challenge Lucian's claim to Maya through formal combat, and if he lost such a challenge, both Maya and Adrian would be executed as abominations whose continued existence threatened the established order. However, there existed an ancient loophole that even Marcus Dracule couldn't ignore. Maya, as a legitimately bonded human, could invoke trial by champion and fight for her own freedom, choosing single combat over the political maneuvering that favored older, more established powers with centuries of accumulated influence and debt. The training that followed was designed to prepare her for enemies who had perfected their killing techniques across lifespans that dwarfed human civilization. Brutal sessions that pushed her enhanced abilities to their limits, while teaching her to think like someone whose survival depended on outfighting opponents with supernatural advantages. Maya discovered that the blood bond had changed her in ways beyond mere physical enhancement, granting her access to reflexes and instincts that felt borrowed from Lucian's centuries of experience, while remaining fundamentally human in their limitations and moral constraints. Adrian helped by sharing intelligence he'd gathered through artwork that revealed itself to be more than mere pictures. His drawings were psychic impressions of the enemies around them, capturing details that surveillance cameras missed and revealing weaknesses that trained warriors often overlooked, his Dampier nature allowing him to see patterns and connections that escaped both human and vampire perception, making him invaluable despite his youth and apparent vulnerability in a war that would determine whether they survived long enough to build the future he represented. The formal challenge echoed through the ancient cathedral's vaulted ceiling like a thunderclap as Maya's voice carried across the assembled vampire courts. Her words carefully chosen according to protocols that Lucian had drilled into her during sleepless nights of preparation, and the stunned silence that followed her invocation of trial by champion revealed just how thoroughly she had shattered their expectations. Representatives from 12 major courts filled the shadowed pews, their pale faces turned toward the altar where Maya stood beside Lucian, while Marcus Dracule's crimson eyes blazed with fury from the front row where he'd expected to witness her execution rather than her defiance of laws he'd assumed would ensure her destruction. The choice of Isabella as her opponent sent whispers racing through the assembled vampires like wind through autumn leaves, their ancient tongues carrying speculation and surprise that the human would dare challenge the very vampire who had first revealed the truth about her bonding, the warrior whose skill with blade and fang had earned respect across centuries of conflicts that littered European battlefields with the ashes of her enemies. The neutral ground chosen for their combat was the Cathedral of St. Erasmus, an abandoned Gothic masterpiece that had hosted vampire duels for over 400 years after being deconsecrated and forgotten by human authorities, who couldn't explain why their congregations fled from unexplained deaths and whispered rumors of shadows that moved without bodies to cast them. Stone gargoyles leered down from flying buttresses worn smooth by weather and time, their carved faces seeming to shift and change in the candlelight that provided the only illumination in a space where electric lights had never been installed, where the rules of engagement were carved into marble tablets behind the altar in languages that predated modern civilization. Trial by combat until death or submission, with no interference from either side, no weapons beyond those granted by nature or enhanced through supernatural gift, an absolute acceptance of the outcome by all parties, regardless of political consequences that might follow from victory or defeat. Lucian's fury at Maya's choice burned through their blood bond like acid through flesh, his centuries of protective instincts warring with legal obligations that bound him as surely as iron chains, his desperate arguments that she had no chance against an opponent who had perfected her combat skills across lifespans that spanned the rise and fall of empires, falling on ears that had already made their choice between certain death through political maneuvering and possible survival through personal combat. As they prepared for the trial in the cathedral's ancient vestry, surrounded by rotting tapestries and broken stained glass that caught candlelight like fragments of captured rainbows, Lucian revealed the deepest fear that had haunted him since the blood bond's completion. If Maya died in combat, the severing of their connection would likely kill him as well, leaving Adrian alone and defenseless against enemies who would show no mercy to a Dampier child whose only protection lay in the bonds that tied him to parents who had chosen to shield him from a world that wanted him destroyed. Their growing love had become both strength and vulnerability, a weapon that could be turned against them by enemies who understood that emotional connections were often more effective than physical torture in breaking supernatural beings who had learned to endure centuries of pain without surrendering what they valued most. Maya felt Lucian's terror through their bond, his desperate wish that she would choose safety over principle, but she also sensed his pride in her courage, his unwilling respect for a decision that honored the warrior she was becoming, rather than the helpless human she had once been when fate first brought them together in a school parking lot that seemed like another lifetime ago. The cathedral filled with witnesses as sunset approached. Ancient vampires whose presence carried the weight of centuries settling into pews carved from wood that had grown in forests cleared before Columbus discovered America, their eyes reflecting candlelight like captured stars as they prepared to witness combat that would determine not just Maya's fate, but the future of vampire society itself. Isabella entered through the cathedral's main doors at the stroke of midnight, her movement fluid as water flowing over stones worn smooth by time. Dressed in black leather that had been blessed by priests whose bones had long since turned to dust in forgotten graveyards scattered across Europe's blood-soaked battlefields. Her beauty was terrible and perfect, unmarked by the centuries of violence that had shaped her into a weapon of supernatural precision. Her pale skin luminous in the candlelight that cast dancing shadows across walls where the ghosts of murdered priests were said to whisper prayers for souls too damned for conventional salvation. The combat began without ceremony or fanfare, Isabella's first strike coming faster than human eyes could follow, her silver blade singing through air that seemed to thicken around them as supernatural forces acknowledged the ancient ritual being performed in a space consecrated by centuries of spilled blood. Maya barely managed to avoid the cut that would have opened her throat, rolling aside with reflexes enhanced by the blood bond while drawing her own weapon, a sword forged from blessed steel that burned with cold fire in her grip. Isabella's centuries of experience showed in every movement, each attack flowing seamlessly into the next like choreographed death, her blade finding gaps in Maya's defense that shouldn't have existed yet somehow did, drawing blood from wounds that healed almost instantly through supernatural enhancement that kept Maya fighting when any normal human would have fallen within seconds. But Maya's human creativity and unpredictability gave her advantages that Isabella's vampire nature couldn't anticipate. Sudden changes in rhythm and strategy that disrupted patterns of attack refined across lifetimes of combat against opponents who fought according to rules that Maya had never learned and therefore couldn't be bound by in her desperate struggle for survival. The battle raged across the cathedral's nave, while vampire spectators watched in absolute silence, their ancient laws forbidding any intervention that might influence the outcome of combat that would determine questions too important to be decided through political compromise or diplomatic negotiation. Isabella confessed between strikes that she fought not from hatred, but from duty. Her genuine belief that Maya's existence threatened the careful balance that kept vampires hidden from humanity, driving every cut and thrust of her blade. Her fear that bonded humans could expose vampire society to mortal governments equipped with weapons that could end their species in nuclear fire, giving desperate urgency to attacks that came closer and closer to ending the fight with Maya's death. The turning point came when Maya realized she wasn't fighting to destroy vampire culture, but to expand it, to prove that humans and vampires could coexist without one dominating the other. Her defensive strategy shifting to offense, as she began demonstrating through combat that power bonded with humanity created strength rather than weakness, that cooperation could achieve what centuries of domination and fear had failed to accomplish in keeping both species safe from the dangers that threatened them separately. Isabella's surprise at this shift in tactics cost her the advantage she had maintained through superior skill and experience. Maya's unconventional approach exploiting weaknesses that the vampire had never been forced to guard against in centuries of fighting opponents who shared her supernatural nature and cultural assumptions. The final exchange came when Isabella stumbled over debris from a broken pew, her perfect balance disrupted just enough to leave her vulnerable, and Maya's blade found her throat with the precision that hours of desperate combat had burned into muscle memory, enhanced by supernatural gifts. But instead of taking the killing stroke that ancient law permitted, Maya chose mercy that stunned every vampire witness into absolute silence. Her decision to spare Isabella's life, when she could have taken it proving that humanity bonded with supernatural power, created possibilities that neither species had imagined in isolation. Isabella yielded with grace that honored both her defeat and Maya's choice, acknowledging Maya's right to exist within vampire society with words that carried the weight of formal recognition from courts that had gathered to witness what they'd expected to be an execution. However, Marcus Dracule's roar of fury shattered the cathedral's sacred silence as he declared the ancient laws obsolete and the trial's outcome irrelevant to his determination to eliminate threats that endangered vampire secrecy. His rejection of legal precedent that had governed their society for millennia, forcing vampires who had served as neutral witnesses to choose sides in a conflict that would determine whether their species evolved or stagnated in traditions that no longer served their survival needs. The assault that followed transformed the cathedral into a battlefield where centuries of political alliances dissolved in moments, forcing an uneasy cooperation between Maya's supporters and Isabella's followers against extremists who believed that any change to vampire society represented unacceptable weakness that would lead inevitably to their destruction at human hands. The battle was chaotic and destructive. Ancient vampires wielding abilities that shattered stone columns and brought sections of the cathedral's roof crashing down in explosions of dust and debris, while Maya fought alongside former enemies who had found common ground in their shared desire to survive the madness that Marcus Dracule's extremism had unleashed upon them all. The conflict reached its climax when Marcus himself confronted Lucian in single combat before the ruined altar, their clash of supernatural forces creating shockwaves that cracked the cathedral's foundation stones and sent gargoyles tumbling from their perches to shatter on floors slick with blood from both human and vampire wounds. Maya felt Lucian's danger through their bond, the ancient vampire's desperate struggle against an opponent whose age and power matched his own, but whose ruthlessness exceeded anything Lucian had ever embraced. And she abandoned her own fight to rush to his aid, just as Marcus's claws found Lucian's heart. The blood bond that had seemed like chains became salvation as Maya and Lucian combined their abilities for the first time. Her human determination merging with his vampire strength to create something neither could have achieved alone, their joint attack overwhelming Marcus with force that surprised even them as it reduced the ancient vampire to ash that scattered across broken stone like gray snow. Victory came at a price measured in more than blood and broken architecture. Vampire society emerging from the cathedral forever split between those who would accept change and those who would resist it until their final breath. The ancient unity that had protected their species for millennia shattered beyond any hope of repair by conflicts that had exposed fundamental disagreements about survival, evolution, and the price they were willing to pay to remain hidden from a human world that grew more dangerous with each passing year. 6 months after the cathedral battle that split vampire society along lines that would take centuries to heal, Maya stood in the marble foyer of Blackthorn Estate, wearing formal robes that marked her as the first bonded consul in vampire history, a position created specifically to acknowledge her unprecedented status as a human, with full rights within their supernatural society. The title carried weight that extended far beyond ceremonial recognition, granting her authority to speak for human interests in vampire courts, while serving as official liaison between species that had coexisted in shadows and suspicion for millennia without finding common ground that could support genuine cooperation rather than mere uneasy tolerance. Her days now split between the estate and Raven's Hollow Academy, the progressive school she and Lucian had established in the mansion's renovated East Wing to serve Dampier children who had previously been hidden away or hunted down by extremists from both sides, who saw them as threats to established order rather than bridges between worlds that desperately needed connection. Adrian was no longer the only child of his kind wandering empty halls in search of someone who might understand his dual nature. 3 other Dampier children having been brought to safety over the months following Marcus Dracule's defeat, each carrying stories of persecution and isolation that made Maya's heart ache with recognition of pain she had once witnessed in courtrooms and crisis centers during her previous life as a social worker. The children ranged in age from 6 to 12, each displaying unique combinations of human creativity and vampire abilities that defied easy categorization, their presence transforming the mansion's ancient corridors into spaces filled with laughter and learning, rather than the brooding silence that had characterized Lucian's centuries of solitary existence. Maya served as their bridge between human and vampire worlds, teaching them mathematics and literature alongside vampire history and supernatural law, helping them understand that their mixed heritage represented strength rather than weakness, evolution rather than contamination. Hope for a future where children wouldn't have to choose between hiding their true nature or facing persecution for accidents of birth they couldn't control. Her relationship with Lucian had evolved into something unprecedented, a true partnership between human and vampire based on choice rather than magical compulsion, their blood bond deepening into emotional connection that transcended the supernatural forces that had first brought them together in circumstances neither had chosen. They worked side by side, establishing policies that would govern Dampier education and protection, negotiating with vampire courts that had accepted the new reality while maintaining defenses against those who still viewed their experiment as dangerous heresy, deserving violent suppression. The mansion's East Wing buzzed with activity, as classrooms filled with children who studied algebra and ancient languages with equal enthusiasm, their questions ranging from homework help to existential concerns about belonging in a world that seemed designed for creatures who fit neat categories rather than hybrid beings who challenged every assumption about what was possible when love transcended species barriers. The converted library served as both classroom and sanctuary, its shelves now holding children's books alongside grimoires and political treatises, while art supplies shared space with protective amulets and emergency medical supplies designed to treat injuries that normal human doctors couldn't understand or heal. Maya often found herself marveling at how naturally the children adapted to their unique educational environment, their resilience in the face of circumstances that would have overwhelmed most adults, serving as daily reminder that evolution often moved faster than established institutions could accommodate change. Isabella had become an unexpected ally in their efforts, her formal acknowledgement of Maya's legitimacy carrying weight with vampire courts that might otherwise have dismissed the Blackthorn family's innovations as dangerous eccentricity. Her testimony about Maya's mercy during their cathedral combat, providing evidence that bonded humans could exercise supernatural power without losing their essential humanity. The former assassin now served as head of security for Raven's Hollow Academy, her centuries of combat experience ensuring that the children could learn and grow without constant fear of attacks from extremists who viewed their very existence as intolerable threats to vampire secrecy. Dr. Winters had been rescued within days of his capture, physically unharmed, but emotionally scarred by interrogation techniques that had revealed the depth of hatred driving vampire extremists who saw cooperation with humans as betrayal of everything their species had fought to preserve across millennia of careful concealment. His return to the household had been marked by determination to continue his medical service, despite trauma that might have broken someone less committed to the cause they all served. His expertise in treating Dampier physiology proving invaluable as more children arrived, seeking sanctuary from a world that offered them no other safe harbor. Thomas had recovered from his wounds with vampire resilience, enhanced by Dampier healing abilities, his survival serving as proof that their kind could endure challenges that would destroy purely human or vampire beings. His leadership of estate security providing the children with role models who demonstrated that being different didn't mean being weak or defenseless against those who threatened what they valued most. The first public art exhibition featuring Adrian's work opened on a crisp October evening, when autumn leaves painted the estate's gardens in colors that rivaled the supernatural beauty captured in his paintings, each piece revealing truths about existing between two worlds that words could never adequately express. Maya watched with pride that transcended any bond magical or mundane as her strange, wonderful boy interacted with human and vampire visitors alike, no longer hiding what he was, but celebrating the unique perspective that his dual nature provided in creating art that spoke to experiences both species could recognize, despite their fundamental differences. His paintings captured moments of beauty and danger with equal skill, sunrises he had never seen before, coming to live at Raven's Hollow Academy, rendered with precision that suggested psychic impression rather than mere imagination, while portraits of household members revealed inner lives that photography could never expose, despite its technical accuracy. Lucian stood beside Maya throughout the evening, their bond now a source of strength rather than obligation. His ancient loneliness transformed into contentment that radiated through their connection like warmth from a fire that would never burn out, regardless of storms that might rage around them. Vampire and human guests mingled with ease that would have been impossible before the cathedral battle, their conversations ranging from art criticism to political discussion about integration policies that were slowly spreading beyond the Blackthorn estate to other progressive households willing to risk change rather than accept stagnation. The exhibition's success proved that Dampier children could find acceptance in both worlds when given opportunity to demonstrate their value rather than hide their nature. Adrian's confident explanations of his artistic techniques serving as bridge between visitors who might otherwise have remained strangers, divided by supernatural barriers they had never questioned. As the evening wound down and guests departed with promises to spread word about Raven's Hollow Academy's innovative approach to Dampier education, Maya discovered an ornate envelope waiting on her desk. its wax seal bearing the crest of the European Vampire Council, along with signatures from courts across 3 continents, requesting her presence to help establish similar integration programs worldwide. The letter revealed that news of their success had traveled faster than official communications, inspiring other vampire families to consider possibilities they had never dared explore when Dampier children were viewed as shameful secrets rather than precious resources deserving protection and nurturing. As she held the letter with hands that no longer trembled when faced with supernatural responsibility, Maya realized that her quiet life as a night janitor had transformed into something she never could have imagined when fate first brought her into contact with a frightened boy, being tormented by bullies who feared what they couldn't understand. She had become a bridge between worlds, carrying authority to reshape the future for children like Adrian, while serving as proof that humans and vampires could achieve together what neither could accomplish in isolation, her influence extending far beyond the estate's boundaries, to touch lives she would never meet in places she had never seen. The story concluded with Maya taking Lucian's hand as dawn broke over gardens, where Dampier children played games that combined human creativity with vampire abilities, their laughter echoing through halls that had once been silent with secrets, but now rang with possibility of a future neither world could have imagined alone. Adrian stood at his easel capturing his first real sunrise on canvas, the golden light streaming through windows that no longer needed protective shutters, because the children who lived here had learned to exist comfortably in both darkness and day, their dual nature providing strength rather than weakness in facing whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Maya's reflection appeared clearly in the window beside Lucian's absence, their hands intertwined as human and vampire, separate but united, casting one shadow in the morning light. While Adrian painted hope in colors that had never existed before, children learned they could belong to both worlds simultaneously without sacrificing what made them unique, their future stretching ahead like sunrise over landscape that promised adventures worthy of the courage they had already displayed in choosing love over fear, acceptance over hatred, evolution over stagnation in a world that finally had room for creatures who refused to fit the categories that previous generations had accepted as immutable law.